2 days ago, Taoiseach George Floyd was buried, and our thoughts and prayers were with his family and the African American people who have been under that knee of suppression for so long. Oireachtas go raibh ann dílis. And that Black Lives Matter movement is continuing and strengthening and correctly building a community response to what needs to be done in the States. But I think we'd all agree that our support for that is best reflected on what we do in countering the issue of racism in our own country. And Taoiseach, I was glad to see yesterday you had an online meeting with Irish people of colour to talk about how we use this special moment to eliminate racism in our own country. And I want to ask you maybe just some thoughts or your thoughts on what specifically we can do in that regard. It was interesting today reading the newspapers, relevant articles. There was a story about the Lecala school in Tyrrellstown, good story in a sense about integration, a young black Irish teacher showing how it can be done, how we can integrate and actually rid ourselves of this scourge. But the statistics were interesting. 1 in 10 of our children from non-Irish or new Irish backgrounds, but only 1 in 20 of our teachers. And I think any of us know in our own constituencies, it tends to be certain schools is where all the, increasingly, we've segregation in our school system, where certain schools take all the new community and other schools have pretty much none. So should we not commit, if we're serious on this issue, to make sure our education system is fully integrated? We don't have such segregation and separation as we start off in life within our school system. Is that not one thing we could commit to try and do? It was interesting, and again in the newspaper today there was a young Irishman, Sean Gallan, giving his experience of being othered, of being from the age of 6, being given that name, you nigger, and explained that sense of how it completely undermines people, and every people I know, friends and relations of colour in this country, and travellers and other minorities, speak of the same experience. It's real. If you look in the policing of that, again, it's interesting. We have to make sure that our policing, as it changes now, the future policing evolves, that it is blind to the issue of colour or ethnicity or indeed postcode, where you might come from. But again, if you look at the statistics, 1 in 10 new Irish, but only 1 in 200 of the Garda Síochána come from new Irish ethnic backgrounds. So that's a second maybe thing we could commit to changing, to making sure that our society is managed, that we don't fall foul and continue to fall foul of the lack of security for all our people in our country. Thirdly, Taoiseach, and I think we are hopefully coming to really address this, the issue of how we treat those who are most vulnerable, as people seeking asylum and refuge here, that we have to immediately end the provisions where we are putting those people in conditions, in direct provision, which fundamentally undermines their mental health and their ability to make this country, if they are approved to stay here, their home. That the way we're doing things is fundamentally undermining their health, and that has to stop and that has to change. And I welcome the sense I have for parties across this House that that's something that we're all committed to doing, to be the very best we can in accepting and welcoming asylum seekers to our country, acting quickly in terms of deciding what their status is, but also treating them with real care and respect while they're here and when and if they stay. Fourthly, and just in terms of what we can do, and this is probably the most complex, is the issue about how we manage online communications where some of the overt racism and extremism, we all aware of it here as politicians, we see the certain strands of it, but to be honest, not the worst. And we have a special responsibility because we're home, our European headquarters, European, Middle East and Africa, MEA headquarters for most of the social platforms, where a lot of this hate speech is now evolving, racist often in tone, terrifying. And how we manage that, how we work with the companies, which we have to do, to make sure that they have duty of care stitched into their very business models. So it's not just kind of impossible to police every single online communication on every single social media network, but that the business models, the regulatory systems, the ethos and the ethics, as well as the rules and the punitive measures are in place to make sure that we don't see what has been a characteristic of these online platforms, further division and derision as becoming acceptable everyday part of our lives. And lastly, and I'll give you as much time, Taoiseach, as I can because I'm keen to hear your views, do we not need to make sure that we as a country see the maxim that my security is maximised when my neighbour's security is protected too? And that their security is best guaranteed when prosperity is shared across this country. That we aim or set ourselves the target, the country with the least divergence in wealth and income as best we can. Because I think that is often sometimes behind, if you look at what is the source and root and fear of these racist tendencies and instincts, it is sometimes communities that feel that they are being left behind, and that breeds resentment and fear of the other, fear of the new. And indeed, for new communities coming in, we have to make sure that they can get the leg up and they're not on a kind of a separate economy, the black economy literally, where they're not paid properly and the working conditions are not as good. We will manage this issue about tackling racism best if we create a social justice economy which actually guarantees everyone's security and prosperity, and in that we remove the scourge of othering and of that basic divergence and racism which exists in our country. Let's not pretend it doesn't, but it's our job to try and help remove. I'm interested to hear what your conversation, how it went yesterday, and if you agree with those sort of measures.
Thanks very much, Deputy, for your contribution. I think we all agree and accept and understand that racism exists in every society. It takes different forms, but that makes it no less real. And sadly, Ireland is by no means immune to the scourge of racism. Had a very good engagement yesterday, which you mentioned, with Irish people who are black and Irish people who are of colour. A Zoom call went on for over an hour, really to hear from them and to share our collective experiences of racism in Ireland. And among the kind of things that came up as ideas that we might pursue, one certainly is around education, making sure that we educate children better in schools and throughout the educational cycle about racism, about what it is, how to identify it and how to deal with it. And one thing that I thought was interesting from the conversation is that a lot of the education that we now have around racism is telling people what not to say. Don't use this word, don't use that name, don't say this. But actually a lot of people feel that to be disabling. They don't know what they should say. How do we talk about the elephant in the room, which may be race? So I think that's part of what we have to do. Secondly, we do need a reform of our incitement to hatred laws. That work has started already by the outgoing government. I hope it will be completed by the next one to modernise our hate speech and hate crime laws. Again, work underway that needs to be completed by the next government is the creation of an online safety commissioner and a proper infrastructure legally underpinned to require social media platforms to take down things that are racist or offensive or incite violence or hatred in any way. One thing I strongly agree with the Deputy on is the need to set a target to have a number of people from ethnic minorities in areas of the public service. We have a health service that's very diverse, although less so as you go up towards the senior positions, not so much in the Gardaí, not so much in the Defence Forces, not so much in the education sector, as the Deputy mentioned, not at all in the civil service, which is very white, including the Department of Equality, for example. And that actually needs to change. So we need to have, I think, a target for people who come from ethnic minority backgrounds, but also dedicated recruitment campaigns to encourage people, because we do need a generation of young people growing up in Ireland who are people of colour to see black and brown school principals, judges, Cian Corla perhaps in the future. Who knows? Visibility and opportunity is really important. Finally, on direct provision accommodation centres, as I've said in the House before, I agree that much of it is substandard, the accommodation, and that needs to change. I don't think it would be honest to say that we can immediately end it, and we need to be honest about that. It's around for 20 years, 9 years under my party, 4 years under the Green Party, let's not forget. And if we could provide owned or self-catering accommodation to 7,000 people tomorrow, we probably would, but we can't. And we don't also know how many will come in this year and next year and other years, but I do think we should try to phase it out. Briefly on income inequality, and that can drive racism, I agree with that. That we're one of the few countries in recent years that has actually reduced income inequality. We should be proud of having achieved that as a country. Poverty has fallen every year for the past 5 years, so has deprivation. That needs to continue, and as we've demonstrated in the past 5 years, the best way to reduce poverty and to reduce income inequality is job creation and opportunity. And that's what needs to be reinforced, that we don't go backwards in terms of our commitment to job creation and providing people with opportunities to advance themselves.